Welcome everyone to Action for Healthy Communities, our webinar today looking at the benefits of a provincial law for ecosystem health. I want to begin by thanking and recognizing Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, in whose territories our office is situated. And really, in light of our topic today, in terms of ecosystem health, really honoring their stewardship and management over many millennia in this region. My name is Jessica Clogg. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Counsel at West Coast Environmental Law. And before we get going, I'm just going to quickly turn it over to Alexis Stoimanoff, our Director of Communications, for a few logistical details.
Hi everyone, and thanks Jessica. I'll just take a minute to share a few technical notes before we start. Participants are automatically muted during the webinar, but you are welcome to participate in the discussion using the chat. If anyone is not familiar with Zoom, I'm sure most of us are at this point, the chat button is in the bottom of your window. And then there's also the Q&A that we'll use for a Q&A at the end of the session. So you can type questions throughout the webinar into either the Q&A function at the bottom or through the chat. One thing to note about the chat, if you want your messages to be visible to all the other webinar participants and not just panelists, be sure to click on the little drop-down menu in the chat box to select all panelists and attendees. Like I said, we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end of the session, but you're welcome to submit your questions throughout. And lastly, please note that the webinar today is being recorded. So recording will be shared with participants in the following days. I think that's mostly it for housekeeping, so I'll pass it back over to Jessica.
Excellent, thanks. So in terms of the flow of our time together today, I'll begin with some brief remarks, looking at a thought paper which West Coast Environmental Law has published today, which explores these themes. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by two city councillors, Nadine Nakagawa, a New Westminster City Councillor, and Amy Lubik, a Port Moody City Councillor. So after I've introduced the topic, we'll have a local government councillors panel and then a Q&A. So hopefully giving us a chance to dive into any questions you might have. And we'll finish up by shining the light for a moment on two resolutions that will be considered at the UBCM convention next week and what you can do in support. So with that, I'm just going to bring up some slides and dive into the topic. And is that showing up all right for everyone?
Good.
Excellent. All right, there's our brief agenda for our time. So it's on this topic, biodiversity and ecosystem health, it's sometimes hard to know where to begin the story. Some people would say that the story actually begins right back in the early days of British Columbia, when our laws were developing and a legal framework that was really focused around encouraging resource development sprung up. We've got our Forest Act, we've got our Mines Act, we've got our Mineral Tenure Act. And really over the decades, British Columbia's laws have developed in a way that is fragmented. It's developed in a way that even as later environmental protections began to be included in provincial laws, they still tend to be within these resource statutes. So for example, when you want to know about biodiversity measures for forests, you're going to go to the Forest and Range Practices Act, or you're going to a statute that's about resource development. West Coast has done a lot of analysis over time. Some of you may remember a paper from about a decade ago that had the headline "Hardwired for Failure." This idea that when it comes to managing for ecological and community resilience, that BC's laws and policies are truly hardwired for failure. And I won't go into in this webinar a lot of those details. That's everything from exemptions and loopholes that allow economic considerations to trump ecosystem health, designations, management objectives, legal requirements that aren't applicable to most types of development, the absence of mandatory triggers for conservation planning, and so on. I mean, that's the history. That's sort of where we've been and the foundation we're kind of starting from today. Into this mix, quite recently, many of you will be familiar with an independent panel, Al Gorley and Gary Merkel, reporting out on a new future for old forests. Now, this was a strategic review of how British Columbia manages for old forests. But this panel came forward with a very powerful and important recommendation, which is, I think, the foundation of our sort of starting point for today. And the independent old growth panel, or OGSR, recommended that British Columbia declare conservation and ecosystem health and biodiversity of British Columbia's forests as an overarching priority, and to enact legislation that legally establishes this priority for all sectors. Now, this was, I think, a very innovative recommendation, and certainly as a group of environmental lawyers who care very deeply about ecosystem health and biodiversity, a really powerful stepping off point, particularly when our provincial government committed to implement all 14 recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review, and setting in motion the process that we're focused on today. So, as I mentioned, West Coast published a thought paper today. We'll put in the chat the link of how you can access it. And it really explores two questions. What are the impacts and the cumulative effects of the provincial prioritization of resource development over ecosystem health on communities in British Columbia? And secondly, how can a new overarching provincial law to protect biodiversity and ecosystem health support community and ecosystem resilience? And in the paper, this isn't one of the previous West Coast analysis that gives you all the statutory references of all the ways and all the barriers within our provincial laws. This paper really focuses on a handful of case studies that tell the story of what the impacts are and what some of the potential for moving forward is. So the first case study in the paper relates to risks to drinking water from the current provincial framework. And many of you may have followed the situation in the Alberni Valley, where residents of Port Alberni, as well as the Seychet and Hupachessis First Nations, have been grappling for many years with the fact that the large portion of their watershed is privately held in private managed forest land designation. And I think any of you who followed this topic will know many of the longstanding issues with the weak protection on private managed forest lands. I mean, certainly the same regulations that apply even to provincial forests don't apply. And really you have a situation where the economic and individual interests of private landowners are driving what happens in these communities' drinking watersheds. Now, there's recently been some progress in the area where you have one of the private companies saying, okay, listen, we'll voluntarily defer logging for 25 years. But the reality remains that in our current legislative framework, the long-term health of communities depends on foresters and community corporate executives when it comes to the drinking water in this area. And really to backstop that, you know, the result is that local communities in the Alberni Valley lack control over and security of their water supply. And so what the thought paper essentially does is say, okay, let's turn our mind to how this situation could be different if we had an overarching provincial law that required decision makers to center biodiversity and ecosystem health. And we'll be getting to some of the ideas that we have to put on the table in terms of how that could help to secure drinking water supply, not just in the Alberni Valley, obviously, but certainly in other places that are facing similar challenges. The second case study in the thought paper relates to risks to fisheries and wildlife, and offers a series of examples about experiences in the Ominika and northeast of the province, in Treaty 8 country and in Dakhak or Yunkadeni carrier territories. And this is really a situation where the cumulative impacts of the statutory framework that doesn't prioritize ecosystem health have been felt for many, many years. And some of you may be familiar with some of these maps showing cumulative anthropogenic change in the Peace region. So I think this has been in the media a lot, which is heartening to see. Certainly we have a situation where the various permitting processes and decision-making under resource statutes continue to have a negative impact and fail to manage cumulative effects. And of course, we saw that in the Blueberry River decision recently, where the court really took BC to task for its failure to deal with the cumulative treaty impacts to Blueberry River. We have an Environmental Assessment Act, much stronger than it used to be, but currently the province isn't pursuing regional assessments enabled under the Act. And of course, it only applies to the largest projects, still really not dealing with cumulative effects. And I've just offered what I often consider one of the most egregious examples. I'm sure many of you will be aware that environmental objectives under the Forest and Range Practices Act need only be met to the extent they don't unduly restrict the supply of timber from BC forests. So again, just offering those examples of some of the ways our laws are hardwired for failure. The paper also explores some of the experience in the Ominika, ranging back historically to decisions to say dam and reverse the Nechako River. Mining, everything from the provincial free entry system that assumes mining is the highest and best use of most lands in BC to our experience with Mount Polley. We have this situation where we can see long-standing impacts of the challenges in our regulatory framework. The third case study in the paper focuses on risks of flooding and landslides. And I mean, I think it's still, I think, very clear in our minds, just the images of the tremendous flooding we saw in November 2021, you know, from the Nicola Valley to the Lower Fraser. And those events really highlighted the underlying vulnerability of many communities in floodplains, as well as the transportation corridors and farmland in the Lower Fraser. I mean, local governments are largely responsible for the operation and upkeep of these hundreds of kilometers of dams with very limited resources. And at the same time, dikes and pump stations also have harmful impacts on fish and fish habitat, creating barriers to fish passage, channelization, loss of riparian areas, wetlands, etc. And so, I mean, again, the reality here is that increased flooding and landslides, you know, they're not only caused by atmospheric rivers and a changing climate, but also by our management practices in upper watersheds. And there's just a reference in the paper to, you know, a 2019 study that really highlighted that sensitive link. So again, we sort of are asking ourselves, how could a new law for biodiversity and ecosystem health be a critical piece of an integrated approach to reducing flood and landslide risk? So the path forward. I mean, I want to emphasize in raising this that you know, there is a provincial government commitment on this. It is going to need to be a process which is co-developed with Indigenous nations, with robust local government and public participation. We have lots of ideas as environmental lawyers, but this is in its early stages. It needs to be developed in a good way through robust process. But here are some of the ideas of that we're trying to sort of generate that thinking. How could the world be different if this recommendation of the Old Growth Strategic Review was implemented? I think we need to be thinking about conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem health in a slightly different way, ensuring that Indigenous understandings of those relationships in their territories are recognized and respected. And I think the province has been very clear, and I think rightfully so, that this work needs to be grounded in recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction and land management practices. So foundationally, the core recommendation is that this law would legislatively establish conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem health as an overarching priority for all government decisions affecting the environment and land and resources. Some of the tools that we could envision perhaps a new advisory body of Indigenous and Western scientists who could play a key role in ensuring that best available science and Indigenous knowledge is setting management standards, in informing proactive planning for ecosystem health and biodiversity protection at all scales, and ensuring we've got the legal tools we need for implementing those plans across all resource sectors. We envision that this type of law would enable creative co-governance options, obviously with that recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction and decision-making, but creating those robust ways in which local communities can have a say in what's happening in their backyard. We envision that this law could potentially have an enforceable biodiversity shield provision, right? So the question of how does this get enforced? What if there was that requirement on the provincial government to center biodiversity and ecosystem health was something that local governments or citizens could actually challenge them on in court? What type of impetus could that start to provide for doing things different? And just coming back to this idea of proactive planning, like in our earlier work, one of the limitations we identified in provincial law is that there was no trigger for proactive conservation planning. You know, the local government officials on here know you do your planning, right? We've had experiences with strategic level land use plans in BC back in the 90s. They didn't apply to private managed forest land. We have a fragmented system and at the moment, a very limited budget from the province in terms of modernizing land use plans. So we could see a provincial biodiversity and ecosystem health law as being a catalyst and a trigger for ensuring that that more integrated, more holistic approach to planning, informed by best available science and Indigenous knowledge, actually happens. And we believe that steps like these could go a long way towards mainstreaming this sort of critical biodiversity lens in every decision about the environment and natural resources that the government makes. So what are the benefits? In fact, I'd love to engage this group in that conversation, because really at this stage, this is a thought paper. This is saying, let's start the conversation about how the world could be different if our laws centered ecosystem health. Some of the potential benefits, if we were to do so, integrated rather than fragmented decision-making, actually finally getting our heads around management of cumulative impacts. There's been some progress around assessing cumulative effects with the provincial framework, but there is no requirement for that information to be used in decision-making. A greater local voice in decision-making for affected communities. And we believe reduced infrastructure and emergency management costs as we begin to center nature-oriented solutions and have a more inclusive approach to determining how, for example, we build back better after flooding. We believe there are more resilient approaches that could reduce costs over time and get us out of the cycle of catastrophic impact and rebuilding and into a better place. And ultimately, this is about resilience, not just ecological and community resilience, but the resilience of our local economies. So I hope that that's triggered some ideas for everyone, maybe some questions. We're going to move now to our local government councillors panel. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the floor over to Nadine Nakagawa from New Westminster. Thanks so much.
Thanks. That was so informative and so helpful. So New Westminster is on the unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking people. And as the original colonial capital, we have a lot of work to do to build relationships with people whose lands we're on. Beyond reconciliation, though, is decolonization. And I think that this is actually an important piece of decolonization, is actually thinking about our connections and the interconnectedness of the natural environment. And something I often reflect on as a councillor is how we consider strategies very, very separately. Like we'll consider a tree planting strategy, and then we consider a housing strategy, and then we consider a park strategy. And we really like to slice and dice these ideas and to not consider the interconnections between things. New West is also an incredibly dense and built out community that is very, very, it's very small. I think we're only something like 9 kilometers by 9 kilometers. So we don't have a lot of natural land left to deal with. And so hearing Jessica talk about forest strategy and in the rural regions, it's so obvious so that impacts New Westminster, that we can't alone address issues like air quality, and thinking about that so much around the heat dome last year, but also we have air quality issues as well with smoke and forest fire, that it's too hot inside and then it's smoky outside, and we can't plant enough trees in our community, and we don't have enough green space and parks to ourselves remedy these issues. So we have to think about our province as a more interconnected system, I think. So did bring a motion with the support of West Coast Environmental Law earlier this year about supporting the province to have a biodiversity strategy. And I think this is an easy thing to support. We maybe are getting a little desensitized to the idea of crises, because there's just so many crises right now: climate crisis, pandemic, poison drug supply crisis, housing crisis. But we also have a biodiversity crisis. And at the end of the day, the housing crisis, the inflation rates, all these things about livability and affordability, no jobs on a dead planet, no living on a dead planet. And the climate is one piece, but I think we sometimes forget the environment and biodiversity within that. And something I've been learning on a personal note during the pandemic is trying to learn about local plant life more, recognizing that often I'm walking around the city and I just don't even know any of the local plants that are around me, the yarrow or the plantain. I can't recognize what the mushrooms are and whatnot. And so just trying to think about the fact that no matter how hard we try to push the environment away from us, even in the most urban cities, New West being one of the most urban, it's very clear that we have to cultivate biodiversity. We have to support it, not just in our local community, but throughout the province and more regionally. And so, I would love to see this more broadly supported by more councils and by more cities, going to UBCM, encouraging the province, and doing everything that we can to build this in to our strategies. And again, just thinking about the interconnectedness of all of these issues, all of the crises. It's overwhelming, but I think it's also hopeful to think that we can, if we support this, we are supporting a more livable community. We are supporting issues relating to climate. And so it can seem really overwhelming at times to think about just how much work is ahead of us. But I think that this provides a real opportunity to actually have a more holistic view about the way that we approach these issues, and really looking forward to what Amy has to say as well.
Our next speaker is Amy Lubik, who is a Port Moody City Councillor, and looking forward to your remarks. Thanks, Amy. And thanks, Nadine.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm very excited to read that paper. And it just got me thinking so much. And I also loved Nadine's words. Thank you so much for that. I actually have a background in health research, so I did a little bit of a geek out on this particular session. But I think it's really important for us to remember that, when cities started really, when cities started developing in North America, we were responsible for water and sewage and pests and housing mainly due to trying to control preventable diseases. And we're still responsible for all of these things. And we sometimes forget where that comes from. And I think protecting biodiversity is essential to the health of our residents. So I want to take a bit of a macro to micro view of why I think these are important. One of the things that we don't often think about is that during this time of climate change, of ecological crisis, we're seeing an increase of different diseases, from cancer to vector-borne disease from mice and insects. And the medicine that we often depend on is discovered in the natural world. And that is something that, you know, I think it's important to recognize and to respect also for Indigenous peoples. That, the natural medicines and the ways of life are dependent on those systems. But when I think about things like Taxol, which is one of the most commonly used cancer treatments, it was actually discovered in the yew trees of British Columbia forests. And these trees are now endangered, partly due to overharvesting and partly due to habitat loss and changes in the climate. And recommendations to protect these species, as well as the rest of the forests, include habitat restoration and ecosystem enhancements. And I think that that's extremely important. And of course, we don't have, as local governments, we don't have the jurisdiction over those vast habitats and territories, which is why it's so important to have provincial legislation. On both a local and international level, we've seen a rise in diseases, again, due to the loss of biodiversity. So usually bacteria and viruses and other things are kept in check by a balance in the system. But when we throw it off and when there's more human-caused disturbances, we tend to see some of the really beneficial creatures that need very specific habitats. We lose those creatures and we get an increase in more opportunistic and adaptable creatures, which actually tend to be a bit better at being hosts to different viruses that help, that unfortunately affect humans. And so things like we're seeing more West Nile virus in Canada, other insect-borne diseases. And you know, one of the things that we forget is that the biodiversity of the birds and the other creatures in those systems actually keep those pests and mosquitoes in check. So that's extremely important. And those are things that happen within our communities, that those ecosystems. It's also, of course, essential to our food systems. And again, that's something that we need to all come together on. You know, in Port Moody, we don't have a lot of growing area. We don't have any. We have community gardens, which are wonderful, but that's not really going to get us all that far when it comes to this increasing the changes in habitat and in biodiversity that come with a changing climate. So the farms are managed by humans, but they're still ecosystems. So the plants and the soil and the animals provide the nutrients and root systems, which hold the soil in place. The plants provide food and habitat for beneficial insects and pollinators, which manage pests. And that's actually linked to agricultural productivity. And we need, again, in this changing climate, to be thinking about how we can have better food sovereignty and food security here in BC. Quebec has actually started trying to incentivize farmers to use biodiversity to control agricultural issues, which is actually much healthier for people and the environment anyway. On a more local level, one of the things that we're talking about a lot is our tree canopy and our forests. And these ecosystems really work together, and we're losing them due to habitat erosion or invasive species. And when we put the health of these trees at risk, as Nadine mentioned, you know, those are the things that help us keep our neighborhoods cool in extreme heat events. They help clean our air, and also in things like floods and landslides, they keep they help keep those type of disasters in check. There's also some really interesting studies that show that increasing biodiversity in urban forests is correlated, at least, to lower rates of heart disease, stroke, and mental health challenges. So the last thing that I want to talk about is that as humans, we sometimes forget that we are ecosystems unto ourselves. We have something in us and on us called our microbiome. And that is beneficial bacteria that lives in us and on us. And this is really important for our digestive health, for our immune systems, and also for our mental well-being. There are some studies that show that the diversity of a person's microbiome, which is basically like another organism, is directly correlated to the health of their environment and the biodiversity of their environment. So it's really important for us to remember that we are part of the ecosystems. So I think that those are some of the reasons why I think that that these UBCM motions and this type of advocacy to the province is extraordinarily important, as well as, of course, one of the reasons why we in Fort Moody supported bringing these motions forward was that we're kind of echoing the calls from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And in a time when reconciliation is so critical, those are the type of things that I think that we need to be doing. So thank you so much for giving me the time.
Thank you both. We're going to open things up now for questions. You can use the chat. And in just a moment, my colleague, Deborah Carlson, who's a staff lawyer with our Green Communities program, is also going to join us in case to support with answering questions. So please go ahead, use the chat, use the Q&A, and we'll get the conversation going.
Awesome. Thanks so much to all the panelists. It looks like we have a couple questions coming in. I'll give folks a few more minutes to enter questions again in the chat or in the Q&A section. There were a couple questions that came in ahead of the webinar though, so maybe we can start with those. So one of the big questions around the biodiversity law is why this legislation, why a biodiversity and ecosystem health law rather than a potential species at risk act, which is something that's been called for in the province for a long time.
Yeah, and I think it's a timely question because you know, of course, there is also a UBCM resolution around a Species at Risk Act. I mean, I think there's two answers to it. First of all, a biodiversity law could address many of the same things that are addressed in best practices for dealing with species at risk. The focus, however, is on a more holistic focus on ecosystem health. So actually maintaining ecological integrity and dealing with restoration before we get to the place where we have endangered species. So it is a more holistic focus and a sort of a more overarching approach. The second answer, though, is really a political one. When we look at the provincial government mandate letters to ministries and we look at the commitments that have been made, the provincial government has committed to implement all 14 of the Old Growth Strategic Review recommendations, including recommendation for overarching legislation to protect biodiversity and ecosystem health. And unfortunately, there is no current mandate that we're aware of at the provincial level for standalone endangered species legislation. So I think that's a bit of the realpolitik of it. At this time, a focus on a more overarching proactive law for ecosystem health appears to have the greatest likelihood of being developed and being implemented. So that's how I think we would see it at this stage, without diminishing in any way the importance of addressing our many species at risk in British Columbia.
Thanks, Jessica. Another question that was submitted earlier was, is there any indication of where Indigenous nations are at on this file?
Yeah, so Amy did mention the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. I'll actually just quickly pull up here a copy of a resolution that was passed by their chiefs in assembly. And hopefully that folks can see that. This was in 2021. And you'll see a number of whereas clauses here, focusing in on those vital cultural and spiritual relationships that Indigenous peoples have with their territories, a foundation in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, referencing the OGSR panel, and then some details very consistent with what we've been talking about in terms of what new legislation could entail. And then the resolution reads, therefore be it resolved that the UBCIC Chiefs and Assembly call on the province of BC to explicitly and publicly commit to the enactment of new overarching legislation, the protection of biodiversity and ecosystem health, to be developed in cooperation with Indigenous peoples and in full alignment with the UN Declaration, to advance the actions that are critical for ensuring title and rights are upheld and used to strengthen biodiversity conservation and management. And certainly our colleagues as well with the BCAFN and the First Nations Summit have carried forward similar messages, they tell us, with the applicable ministers. So I think it is critical here that when we think about a decolonized approach to legislative development, we do now have some precedents, for example, with the development of the DRIPA Act itself, as well as with the environmental assessment legislation that came in relatively recently, where you actually did see co-administration of the legislative development process between the province and Indigenous leadership. And I really think that would be the obvious pathway here. So very much supporting and coming in behind those voices in our words today.
Okay, I think we can move to some of the questions in the Q&A now. A couple of questions here from Olga. One is, how will we address the transboundary issues, such as the Mount Baker drainage basin, i.e. Nooksack and Sumas rivers, which flow into the Fraser during high water events, and also the Columbia River headwaters?
I mean, I think at this stage, in terms of a potential recommended law for biodiversity and ecosystem health, I think the foundation starting point from the OGSR recommendation is to say, how would our decisions be different or be influenced if we prioritize biodiversity and ecosystem health, which of course includes the linkages to ecosystems across borders, across various jurisdictions. But the specifics of what those decisions would be and the processes are all to be developed. So I'd love to hear people have ideas about how those cross-boundary issues, if we were to center an ecosystem health approach, how would decisions be different? How should local communities be involved, et cetera. Yep, someone's saying, watershed catchment management plans are the answer. Again, could a new biodiversity law be a trigger for more holistic integrated planning? But the outcomes, I think, are still to be seen. So, I think it would remain to be seen. We'd hope there would be more thoughtful and more integrated decisions.
Just leaving a moment in case anyone else has anything to add to that. Okay, the next question is about climate. How will the proposed legislation connect to the Climate Change Accountability Act? Would it interact smoothly, or would it interfere with that act in any way?
I mean, certainly the hope would be that it would interact smoothly. And I think I really appreciate the raising the issue of accountability, because I think the question of how accountability to a commitment to prioritize biodiversity and ecosystem health is a really important one. And I think we can learn from the conversations both federally and provincially about climate accountability. For example, could we envision provisions in the new act that would require a reporting out to the legislature about how the requirements of the act are being met each year, et cetera. So I think really it's a question of what could we learn from the conversation and relatively new legislative regimes around climate accountability and start applying that in the biodiversity and ecosystem health context as well. I'm just welcoming my colleague, Deborah Carlson here. I don't know if you want to say a quick hello, Deborah. Deborah heads up our Green Communities program and knows the nitty gritty of the local government world and the environment that we all work in. So welcome, Deborah.
Thanks, Jessica. Been listening in and super interesting discussion.
Okay, we have a question here from Linda, familiar name. What do you think of including a hard target like biodiversity net gain or BNG like that in the UK? As I understand it, all UK building development needs to achieve a 10% biodiversity net gain in a provision that comes in later this year.
I think it's an excellent idea because really, we've been saying this for a long time. If we hope to sort of halt biodiversity loss and begin to reverse, if we hope to manage cumulative impacts on ecosystems and species, it will require that we set some limits. There needs to be standards, ideally informed by best available science and by Indigenous knowledge that, give us a sense of where we need to get to in terms of targets for protection and also limits when we know that too much is enough. Any other thoughts on hard? We're lawyers. We love we love firm standards.
Okay, on to the next question, which is one of the things from Laura, one of the things that threaten biodiversity are invasive species. That issue feels insurmountable to deal with, especially from a local government perspective. We're still failing to even label them at this point or at point of sale, which is a huge policy failure. Perhaps Amy and Nadine, these amazing local environmental leaders, might consider this for a future UBCM.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point, and I think I just want to speak to that sort of sense of overwhelm, and then Amy and Nadine might also want to weigh in on that particular issue. Like, certainly as lawyers, when we look at all of not just the problems within our existing laws, but the gaps, things that are just not being addressed, it is easy to feel overwhelmed. And particularly when we think about change, and in this case, we're talking about legislative change, like how do you deal with that framework or that web of different challenges? And that's one of the reasons why this idea of an overarching law for biodiversity and ecosystem health is so appealing. So the question of, can there be an overarching requirement that effectively trumps or is an overlay across all government decision making? And I would say potentially around regulatory developments, because there's also an issue here of starting to fill in some gaps in a way that could have overarching impact, right? Without eventually, we hope we're going to go in and fix, each statute, deal with the nitty gritty of the specifics. But how could we have an impact across this very broad range of issues to start turning the tide?
Deborah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to add along in that vein. I mean, it's a little bit different, but it is similar in some ways to local governments wanting to do something about plastics in their community. Like, you can try and approach it from the local government level, and we had some action, but it's much more efficient to have whether it's the federal or provincial government, take action on that, on these bigger things where, how these things are coming into communities. How do you, I can see how you can get overwhelmed with trying to deal with them. But if you have, say, the provincial government taking the lead, then you can, develop policies that support the provincial legislation coming into action, but you have some oversight that, and resources available for that.
guess I would just maybe add, this is on a totally different vein, around the invasive species. Yeah, I hear you. Like, we have a natural area in US that's completely overrun with invasive species called Glenbrook Ravine. And the project to rehabilitate it, if you will, is massive. And it's a huge use of resources that we could have used to do something else had it not been overrun with invasive species. And I guess I also think a lot around, I think a lot about the kind of no versus yes. And I would also really love on the other side of like saying like labeling the invasive species, sure, it's sort of a no, is like, what do we actually want for our communities and what is our vision for our communities? And I think I would also be very excited about that, like thinking about abundant food forests and abundant like natural, like I'm actually speaking at a conference later this month called Parks People about foraging in parks and reusing and re-understanding like local plant ingredients and why that's banned and whatnot. So I guess I would, yes, I agree with you, Laura, totally about invasive species. And I really want us to gather around the yeses, the vision, the collective vision of what we're moving towards that sometimes we forget as we're putting up all these ideas of what we don't want.
100% echoing Nadine, and I'll just add, one of the things that I would like to see, like when it comes to biodiversity, is like how to support those environments that can help contain those invasive species, at least so they're like slightly easier to deal with, because I know knotweed is a huge one for us, and like that's amazingly like destructive plant. So there's a lot of, not just store-bought things, but like I'd love for us to be looking at those, like how do we manage things more naturally? And I know that that's an investment, and I think it's important to think of some of these things as an investment versus a cost. And I think it's also important when we're talking about provincial legislation to remember that, every local government is a different size with different problems, with different staff and different ways of doing things. And so one of the things that's, for me, that's really important when we talk about provincial leadership and provincial acts is that, it's very much an equity issue, because there are small communities that would love to do way more than they actually have the capacity, resources, financial or human. So I always think it's really important to take an equity lens to these issues as well. And that's where I think some of the times the province needs to step in.
Thanks, Jill. We did have another question through the chat from Laura, which is, can I get an analysis on the use of QPs or qualified professionals? I wonder if anyone has anything to say about that.
As a starting point, although you may be already familiar with it, Mark Haddock's analysis of more professional reliance more generally a few years back for the province has a pretty thorough look at the question and some of the challenges and some great recommendations for change.
And there's another question, which I think will lead well into your next section, which is, I love the idea of an overarching provincial law to prioritize ecosystem health. What is the best way we, or I, as a small West Kootenay community mayor, may support and promote the establishment of a law such as this?
Excellent. So I'm certainly with thanks to our local government colleagues who were on the call, as well as to Islands Trust, there are resolutions coming forward at UBCM. I'm just going to pull the text up on the screen here. Certainly those of you who are in local government and will be attending UBCM, we encourage you to support the resolutions, encourage others to do so. And if you felt moved to also communicate as a local government directly with Minister Osborne, who's our new Minister of Land, Water and Resource Stewardship, or the Premier, letting them know about your support, that would be amazing as well. So I'm going to pull up the text of that resolution. We'll have our articling students, Shauna and Navjot, who I think are on our Zoom here, will be at UBCM with some further information. If you feel moved to speak in support of the resolutions, that would also be amazing. Let's just quickly get that. Oh, maybe let me just see if I can. Pull that up on the screen here. And we'll also just put this in the chat if you haven't seen it already. I do know I realize we have some community members, interested folks on the call. If your local government, your mayor or councillors are not on this call and you want them to speak out or to vote in favor of these resolutions, we're going to put in the chat a link to an action alert to support you in doing that. Here just briefly is one of the resolutions. They're very, very similar. No problem with supporting both. NR 38 and 39. This is 39. You'll see the focus there on the healthy environment essential for the well-being of residents. References to the Old Growth Strategic Review, and there's sort of the crux of it. Therefore, be it resolved that the UBCM call on the province of British Columbia to work with Indigenous leadership to, in a timely way, develop the process and timelines through which they will develop new legislation to protect and restore biological diversity and ecosystem health in a manner consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with the involvement of local governments, civil society groups, Indigenous and Western scientific experts, and the concerned public. So there you have it. I hope that those of you who will be at UBCM would be in a position to support that resolution. And we've got in the chat those links. We're getting close to the end of our time together. I really appreciate everyone who's come today to learn more. Maybe before we part, I just want to open it up to Nadine, Amy, Deborah, any final thoughts before we send people on their way today?
I guess I might just add that, it's been a real honor to be on a panel with you guys, with all of you folks, and it's been a real honor to share information with everybody in this webinar. I hope that folks will take it forward to their councils and their elected officials and ministers. We have talked about the climate crisis, but we're also in an ecological crisis, and biodiversity laws, legislation is integral for the kind of future that we want to see. So thank you so much.
That's a beautiful note to end on if no one else has further remarks. We will be circulating this recording. You might want to quickly pull any links from the chat, though, that you want to look at before in the next few days. Thank you so much, everyone. Check out the thought paper, support the resolutions. And I was just going to emphasize, Minister Osborne has a number of related things in her mandate letter in terms of really co-developing a new approach to resource management with Indigenous nations and modernizing land use plans, but the urgency is sometimes missing. And so I really welcome your support in bringing home both to our local governments, but also to our provincial government folks that we need action now. And this is one of the ways that we can do it. So thank you all. Thank you very much.